That better? Hi, I am very happy to be here. I'm Susan DeJarnatt from Temple, and I'm especially excited to be on this panel, which is reflections on the teacher strikes, which of course we can hardly keep up. There's a new one every day. I think this panel is also going to be really interesting because I'm the only law person on it. We're going to get a broader viewpoint than sometimes we get in these things, although it's going to be a tough act to follow that first panel. So I want to quickly introduce our panelists, and then we're going to do something a little bit different, which is, well, I'll explain in a minute. On the far end is Dr. John Hale, an associate professor of educational history at the University of South Carolina. John's research has focused on the history of student and teacher activism, so very apropos for this panel, grassroots educational programs during the Black freedom struggle, and the segregationist origins of school choice, a point very close to my heart and scholarship. His award-winning book, The Freedom Schools, A History of Student Activists on the Front Lines of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, examines the role of youth activism in the civil rights movement. And he's currently working on 2 book projects on the history of Southern Black high school student activism and the history of the school choice movement since desegregation. Jennifer, in the middle, Jennifer Berkshire, I've been a fan of for a while. She, among other things, has the Have You Heard podcast, which for anyone remotely interested in issues of public education today is a must. You must listen to Have You Heard, which Jennifer does with Jack Schneider, who is an education historian at Holy Cross, right?
UMass Lowell.
UMass Lowell, sorry. It's in Boston, what can I say? They are just finishing a book called The Dismantlers about the privatization of public education, and it's how it's flooding out in all directions, I guess, if that's fair. Jennifer is an expert. She's a freelance journalist, among other things, and she's going to interview our panelists. So rather than me ask questions, I get to turn that over to her. Finally, we have Dr. Erin McHenry-Sorber, who is a professor of higher education and senior scholar here at West Virginia University Center for the Future of Land-Grant Education. Her research focuses on rural schools and communities with an emphasis on leadership and policy. She's authored publications on rural community teacher strikes, the influence of fracking on the work of rural leaders and on low-income women, critical place conscious leadership, and multi-district leadership, and is currently working on several projects, including rural leadership in times of crisis, the West Virginia teacher shortage, and the West Virginia teacher work stoppage. And with that, I want Jennifer to reflect, who's really been following these nationally, to give us some reflections and then lead us through the interviews.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, and I'm so pleased to be here. I do not have a background in law, so I feel a little bit intimidated after that last panel, but I will do my best. So this past week, when the West Virginia teachers suddenly went on strike again, I found myself in the same situation that I imagine a lot of you were in, desperately searching for information about what was going on. And I found myself not particularly happy with the kind of coverage that they were getting, right? That there was something about an omnibus education bill. I heard that the teachers thought it was retaliatory again for the last strike. There was something about charters and vouchers. So I went looking, and I found a piece that Josh Weishart wrote, and I thought that it was just incredibly smart, and I actually wrote a little bit down about it. And he said that, people were missing some really key and fundamental things about what was happening in West Virginia. One was that there was this sneaky bit in the bill that would have shifted the obligation for funding of some of the schools back onto the counties, and I never saw that mentioned anywhere. But at the heart of what was happening was really this question of liberty, and that the advocates for breaking up the system will argue again and again that they have to protect students and parents from the state. And he argued, Josh made the case that actually they have that totally wrong, that the state responsibility to provide education is a positive liberty. That's what gives students, makes them citizens. And I thought, this is such a powerful explanation of what's happening. And then I thought, well, gosh, it's going to be really hard to pass this off as my own insight with Josh right in the room. So check out Josh's post because it was really smart. So I've been asked to give an overview of what's been going on with the walkouts. And what I really want to do is try to draw the connecting thread between the first round of walkouts and the ones that are more recent. Because the argument that we're hearing a lot of in the press is that there was a round one, which started here in West Virginia and then proceeded on to states like Oklahoma and Arizona. And basically, those were about bread and butter issues. Those were states that had disinvested from public education, and so teachers had no choice but to walk out and shut their schools down. And it's really true, right, that you got to see for yourself the impact of austerity. And it wasn't hard to find people who lead policy in those states actually making, fairly blunt statements that they're not so sure that the state should provide public education anymore. You didn't have to pick up many rocks in places like Oklahoma and Arizona to hear people saying that, we've tried it, but now it's time to do something else. And in Arizona, I think you really saw the clearest example of this, where for a time you were going to have two competing ballot initiatives. One was for a universal version of what we saw proposed in West Virginia this week. These are these education savings accounts. In Arizona, they take the form of edu-debit cards, right? So some portion of the state per pupil funding gets loaded onto a debit card, and parents can spend it on virtually anything they want. It could go to homeschool. It could go to a course. It could go to therapy. They get to decide because it's the parents' right to decide that. And then the teachers brought a competing measure called Invest in Ed that proposed taxing the wealthy at a higher rate in order to fund public education. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, newly stacked by conservative appointees, threw that out. And then the voucher measure did go to the ballot, and it was voted down overwhelmingly. When people are given the option to weigh in, and it's not just a backroom deal over and over again, the public says, we still believe in public education. So these round one walkouts were about very fundamental questions about teacher pay and about funding for public education. And then we get into the next round, which we're in the thick of right now. So we saw LA, we saw Denver, and as of yesterday, we saw Oakland. And what you hear in the press is that, these are still about teacher pay. They're still about fairly bread and butter issues like class size. They're still about school funding. But there's something more fundamental at stake in these strikes as well that I don't think you're hearing enough about, and it very much relates to what we heard our last panel talking about. All three of these cities, Denver, Los Angeles, and Oakland, are very much in the throes of an experiment that now, dates back, really the idea dates back to the Clinton era. And this is this idea that, the government can fund schools, but it really doesn't need to run schools. And, we heard a lot about a school system in the last panel, and the argument here is that, we've tried that. And a school system doesn't really work. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to have a system of schools. And it doesn't really matter who runs the schools, right? As long as they're able to produce the goods. And so in all three of these cities, you now have 30% of kids in charters in LA, 40% in Denver, 30% and rising in Oakland. And so you have basically two competing systems, and I think what does not come through in the press coverage is that the people who run the systems are in this, they're essentially tasked with the job of unwinding the system. And so you would hear that, like, wow, LA's got a lot of charter schools. It's got 250 charter schools. But you never heard that it's actually the school board that authorizes those charter schools. So you're in this weird situation where the structure that oversees these systems is tasked with creating competition for its own schools that then cause the budgetary problems that the teachers are protesting against. So yes, the teachers were very much demanding things like higher pay. In Denver, they were protesting against a very complex system of compensation that's meant to sort of spur them on to be better. But they are, as their numbers dwindle, they are really the last organized force demanding that these school districts remain public. And if you listen closely, you hear something that I think is a little disturbing, and that is that the people who are in these blue cities, the advocates for this brand of education reform, use a lot of language that sounds like the legislators in West Virginia who were so intent on introducing new charter schools and a new voucher program. They argue that the money should follow the child. They argue that it doesn't matter what kind of school it is, as long as the parent, chooses it. And those are really the fundamental things. And that any notion of, you never hear the words that we heard about in the last panel, the words like free, the words like thorough and efficient, and instead you end up with these two competing school systems. So I want you to think about that as we talk to our other panelists today. You probably remember that a few years ago, the NAACP passed a moratorium on charter schools. It got a lot of attention. It was very controversial because people who are very devoted to charter schools felt strongly that this was a terrible thing for the NAACP to do. They suspected very strongly that the NAACP had been bought off by teacher unions. And as a result, because the conversation was so overheated, there was a really interesting argument in that decision that got missed. And the NAACP was arguing, among other things, that privatization in many ways lets the state off the hook for its responsibility for educating poor, and especially poor and minority children. And so why in states that have had to fight so hard to get, in places that have had to push so hard to get the state to produce that, why would you let them off the hook? And so you've seen in other states where there haven't been strikes yet, that this debate is playing out very much in the open. So in places like Georgia and Florida, where you had candidates who nearly won governor, Stacey Abrams and Gillum in Florida, ran very much as pro-public education, pro-investment in public education, pro-state responsibility in education. Now, tragically, this is where we get to the sad part of our story, neither of those candidates lost, and so I'm going to conclude my remarks by taking us to Florida, where it's very unlikely that there will be a teacher strike. I think we're going to hear today that there are lots of places to keep an eye on. Florida, sadly, is probably not one of them. They have all sorts of strict prohibitions. Teachers who strike can lose their certification, they can lose their pension. They have a new law that requires teacher unions to recertify every year. That's likely to knock out some of the larger teacher unions in Florida, including in Miami. So, as I mentioned, the pro-public education candidate lost. It was a very close election. And as a result, Florida is very likely the next state we'll see that's going to go all in for what they're calling universal school choice. And last week, the new governor, Ron DeSantis, made an interesting statement. He said, what makes education public is that it's funded by the taxpayer. It doesn't matter where that money goes. It doesn't matter if it's a district school, if it's a magnet school. It doesn't matter if it's a public charter school. It doesn't matter if it's a virtual school. It doesn't matter if students are getting a tax credit scholarship where corporations donate to a fund. They get a write-off, and then that money goes to pay the cost of tuition at a private, overwhelmingly religious school. And it doesn't matter if it's an education savings account that a parent gets to use to buy homeschooling supplies. It doesn't matter. What makes it public is that taxpayers are funding it. And as education legal scholars, I think people will be very interested to know that choice advocates in Florida are obsessed with that pesky clause in the Constitution. It drives them crazy. They are fixated on how they can get rid of the language about thorough and efficient, about a uniform system. And one thing that I worry about a lot is that I see them using that word uniformity against advocates of public education, that they argue that basically it's just another word for one-size-fits-all, factory model. And so these are, walkouts are incredibly inspiring, and they're making some real progress. They're forcing that debate about what it means to be public. But man, there is also a lot of really scary stuff going on. So we have somebody who followed the West Virginia strike, both strikes, very closely. So I want to start with Erin. And Erin, it's just about exactly a year to the date that all the West Virginia teachers walked out, and actually it was a few weeks before that that the Mingo County teachers got it started with something called Fed Up Fridays, and they got the ball rolling, and we're still feeling the implication of that. As someone who is here and on the ground, I wondered if you could just start by telling us what you think was really exciting about the West Virginia walkout and what we might have missed following it from elsewhere.
Thank you. So I think that outsiders have this misconceived notion that West Virginia is a wholly red state. And they miss this really strong, rich history of labor in the state and labor activism, right? Which goes back to the sort of these mythic tales of United Mine Workers involved in these really violent clashes with mining corporations led by Mother Jones, right? And so we have this strong labor history around mining, and we also do around education. This isn't the first major strike in the state of West Virginia. 1990 marked another almost statewide strike in West Virginia, which followed a largely successful miners' strike, and in which miners picketed alongside teachers in support. And so this time around, we see again teachers rising up in protest, first around issues of pay and a very broken statewide insurance system, and sparked by these southern coalfield school districts where we still have this really huge tradition of strong labor. Something that I think is important to consider is the role of women in leading these movements. So in this period of time where women are leading mass protests around a whole host of issues across the country, we see women really leading this movement in West Virginia. So at the county level, the majority of union leaders in the state are women. And we can contrast that to the state legislature, which is ranked 48th in the nation in the percentage of women sitting in the legislature. So we have this picture of this female-dominated profession protesting against a white male-dominated legislature. This is also important in West Virginia because the state ranks last in the percentage of women who have bachelor's degrees, right? It's around 19%. So we're ranked 51st behind all 50 states and the District of Columbia. That has some really big implications for the teaching profession itself in the state, which is comprised of about 75% women. So it's affecting our teaching pipeline. At the same time that teachers are feeling quite dissatisfied with the status of their profession in terms of pay and in terms of the respect they feel they're getting, particularly from the legislature, particularly from some of the Senate leaders in the state legislature. And so we have this mass shortage in the state, which comprises about 4% of the teaching profession, though that's a little low because of the way we report those numbers. We have some districts, for example, that have one certified math teacher for an entire county. We have other districts that have listed every single subject area as a critical shortage area for their district. And so teachers have been expressing their displeasure with the profession for quite some time. They're walking off the job in large numbers with high attrition rates and really low numbers of people interested in the profession. So we shouldn't really be surprised, right, that teachers have finally said enough is enough. We're going to walk off the job. And if we think about those two ideas in tandem, the teacher shortage in a strange way almost empowers teachers to engage in these mass protests because they have nothing to lose, right? The state can offer any retaliatory measure it wants, revoking certification or legal action. There's nobody waiting in the wings to take these teaching positions. So I think these are all really important keys to thinking about the debate. And also I think we can make connections to this idea of the public good. In a state like West Virginia, which is predominantly populated by rural schools and school systems, we know that rural schools serve as the heart and the social hub of a community. And so teachers that I've talked to have really felt through the first mass protest and through this most recent one that there's been an attack on the sustainability of these community public institutions, and they really argue that they're fighting for the viability of these public schools, which in turn means they're fighting for the viability of the communities they serve.
That's great. So we're going to come back to West Virginia, but John, I want to move on to you because you are an historian, and so you bring a different lens to this. There was a lot of attention paid to the fact that the early walkouts were in states where unions were the weakest, especially as it was happening right around the Supreme Court's DeJarnatt's decision, which was really supposed to, really took aim at states like Massachusetts, where I live, where unions are very strong. So you point out, you wrote a great paper, and you point out that one of the other common themes that drew these states together was that they had a rich tradition of African-American teacher organizing that really hasn't been acknowledged. And I'm imagining that a number of us here today don't know about that. So can you start by going back and filling us in on what we've been missing?
Yeah, so, and I'd love to, because I think it's a point that's overlooked in the southern, especially southern right-to-work states that are organizing, is that teacher organization, in addition to being led by women, this goes back to Margaret Haley's tradition in Chicago and the origins of teacher unions, right? There's another tradition in the South, and we don't hear a lot about the South because they're not going on strike, but South Carolina is currently organizing. North Carolina organized it was a walkout, a one-day walkout, or I think a call-in or a sick-in or something like that last spring. And that's a lot in the South. That's generating a lot of attention in South Carolina that these teachers are even that organized, right? And that draws on a larger Black organizing tradition in the South. And I think it's largely missed, not just by the press or various opinion pieces out there right now, but actually by the teachers themselves. And one, I'm not surprised, because in South Carolina, in other southern and deep southern states, they have higher than national average white teachers in the teaching force. So South Carolina is about 87% white. I think the national average is about 82% white. And I think they're largely missing the tradition that they're acting in, which is a Black organizing tradition. And you even see this in West Virginia. So when we look, to build up on what Zoe is talking about in the first panel, public education in the South is a Black freed person's concept. They wrote this into law. And after this is written into law, and after public or free schools are constructed in the South, Black teachers form Black teacher associations to protect that right to education. So Black teacher associations are immediately politicized, and you can see this in their teacher meeting minutes, in their journals. They're contacting local school district officials. They're protecting that right to an education. They're constantly petitioning for greater resources. One of the greatest examples of this at the turn of the century is a black woman like Septima Clark working with the NAACP and also a member of the Black Teacher Association, overturning these laws that actually say white teachers must teach in African American schools. Every major southern city had these laws until 1919, when Charleston, South Carolina was the last major southern city to overturn it. Black teachers are behind that organization, and black teachers are working with the NAACP to overturn these laws. So after 1919, black teachers teach in black schools. That wasn't always the case. And then in the 1920s and 30s, we have black teacher associations petitioning state legislators as well as their local district officials to teach, what Carter G. Woodson's talking about, Negro History Week, but also the black curriculum. And they're at the front lines of trying to incorporate black history, literature, and culture into the curriculum, which is a political act in the Jim Crow South. And then you get to the 1940s, and we have black teachers on the front lines of a growing civil rights movement around the teacher salary equalization cases. So teachers in the South advocating for higher salaries and raises is nothing new, especially in the black organizing tradition. We see black teachers using the black teacher associations to do this. And then let's just allow me to skip the Brown decision for a second. But what's left of the black teacher associations after the Brown decisions, they're at the front lines trying to defend what's left of the black teaching profession. The most conservative estimates within the first 10 years after the Brown decision are that 38,000 black teachers lost their jobs. That doesn't account for the tens of thousands who just voluntarily left the profession, and it doesn't account for the tens of thousands of black teachers who chose not to go into education because there are other career paths open. So we have black teacher associations leading this struggle. So when we dismiss wholesale tens of thousands of black teachers, now it appears to be a white teachers movement. And I say that not to give credit to Black history because it's Black History Month, of course, the shortest month of the year, but because we see so many issues that white teachers aren't talking about. And again, to reference the panel this morning, but the school-to-prison pipeline was a burning issue in the South, especially South Carolina, but we don't hear white teachers talking about that. In fact, we hear white teachers asking for more discipline and sometimes supporting our more school resource officers in the schools. We don't hear about a lack of black teachers, even though there's resounding research that we're seeing again and again that even one teacher of color can have a tremendous positive impact. So not only are we missing some issues because of not seeing this larger black organizing tradition, we're also missing an opportunity for coalition building. And here I'll also point to Dr. Weishart's essay on the 2018 walkouts in West Virginia, is that where he writes, if we don't, it's gonna take more than lawsuits and court decisions and judicial action for true change. And that's something the NAACP knew, that's something the Black Teacher Associations knew, that if it's just lawyers in the courtroom and if it's just teachers, you may not get very far. NAACP, in my reading of the law, or not reading of the law, but rather my reading of legal history, they wouldn't go into a courtroom if they didn't have community support, if they didn't have parents on board, if they didn't have student organizations such as the NAACP Youth Council behind them. Which is why, if you read Federal Judge Richard Gergel's book, Unexampled Courage, where he writes about the Briggs decision in South Carolina, Thurgood Marshall says, we have this one, when he realized that the community showed up and was lining up outside the door in Charleston to hear this case, that they had this case won. They had the community support. So it seems as if we paid attention to this black organizing tradition a little bit more at this moment in time, we see opportunities for broader issues and for stronger coalition building.
Excellent. And we're going to come back and hear some more about the role that Right to Work played in all of that, because it is with us once more.
Yes.
So, Susan, you are in a city, Philadelphia, where there has not yet been a walkout, but the financial issues that have been so key in places like Oakland and Denver and LA are huge in Philadelphia, and you write extensively about the problem of a district that now has to fund two competing school systems. And I wondered if you would just fill us in a little bit about that. And then I'm gonna ask a quick little follow-up question. You told me last night that you sense that the growing frustration among rural school districts towards the idea that they too must pay for competing school systems now via the cyber charter sector, that's a possible way to form a coalition along the lines of what John was just talking about.
I think that's true. I often think people don't realize, and when you say two systems, I would actually say Philadelphia has 86 systems of public education at this point. That's a bit of an exaggeration because a fair number of our charters are part of chains. So it's probably more like 50 systems of public education because we have the Philadelphia School District, we have somewhere around 84 charter schools that they come and go sometimes. That doesn't count the 12, I think it's 12 at this point, cyber schools in Pennsylvania that draw kids from all over the state, so that's 12 more systems. But Pennsylvania spent, and unfortunately you're always behind the times and the numbers, in the 2016-2017 school year, so a couple of years ago, the school districts across Pennsylvania sent charters 1.7 billion, with a B, dollars. Because the way Pennsylvania funds charters is that kid with the backpack, like when a kid leaves to a charter, the per pupil funding goes with that kid. In Philadelphia, that meant close to $1 billion all by itself. I'm exaggerating a little bit, it was 900 million. It's a lot of money, and when that money comes out of the school district, the costs don't come down in compensation, which is a whole thing I'd be happy to talk to anybody about aside from this panel. But the cyber schools, I think, are largely driving the potential coalition between rural. Pennsylvania is sometimes described as Alabama with Pittsburgh and Philadelphia on either side, and that's kind of accurate. It's a largely rural state, except for those two big cities. And the rural school districts are incredibly poorly funded. They're very involved in the William Penn funding litigation that David mentioned earlier. So a very conservative Republican legislator from one of those districts is advocating that where a school district is offering its own cyber option, then kids who want to go to the existing cyber charters should pay tuition. And that will be really interesting to see what happens from that. I don't know if it will win, but it's an interesting development. So.
Erin, I want to ask you about there was some fascinating polling data that came out this week. A young political scientist at Columbia has been surveying people in all of the walkout states. And what was so interesting was that not only did they find that support for the teachers crossed partisan lines, but that support for the teachers predicted support for future walkouts. That they found that people they're saying that, yeah, we support the teachers and we'll support them again. And this led the political scientists to conclude that the walkouts are actually, you're starting to see them build on one another. One of the things that they found that was so interesting was that the more people got information from the grassroots, the more likely they were to support the teachers. And one way of thinking about this is that the weaker the union structure was, right, the less likely they were to have talking points and an official going to a podium, the more likely they were to rally behind that strike. So as, you know, I'm curious about how you see this in the context of that women's organizing that's been happening here. And really, you know, we're seeing that not just as it relates to teacher walkouts, but we're in the midst of a massive women-led protest movement.
Yeah, I would agree. And certainly that's the case in West Virginia, which also has a pretty large women-led eco-justice activist movement, some national award-winning eco-activists in the state. And I think that the grassroots movement is an important one to take hold of. So we see women's activist chapter organizations opening up around other issues all around the state, which is pretty impressive. And we see, specific to the teachers, some real grassroots organizing with the help of social media. And so the teachers unions and the service personnel unions in tandem can very quickly organize a walkout in ways that they hadn't been able to in previous generations of teacher protests. And what's fascinating about this grassroots effort is that in last year's strike, there was a moment where the state leadership said, okay, let's have a cooling off period and return to the classrooms. And at the grassroots level, the teachers said, no, thank you. We're going to stay out on the picket line. So defying that state leadership structure and moving forward at a grassroots or wildcat level to continue their strike efforts. And there was some question in this most recent strike about whether the public would continue to support its teachers, and it really has. And the teachers have done, I think, some really impressive things to continue to garner that support. So, for example, over half of the schools in West Virginia are school-wide Title I designated schools, so a very large high-poverty population. And so the teachers, in collaboration with other community organizations, are serving lunches to students in parks or other community buildings during walkouts because they know that children might go hungry otherwise. And so they've really been able to craft a narrative around which these protests are not about bread and butter union issues, but are about the education of the state's children. And that if you really care about the education of the state's children, you should be in support of these teacher protests, because that's what they're all about. And I think that we should wait and see if the teachers in this state will walk out again, because the union leadership has authorization from those county unions to strike again at any point in time in this legislative session. And that's quite possible, right? Because the teachers have a real distrust of the legislature and its ability to pass through clean legislation without some of these privatization efforts.
I have a quick follow-up question before we turn back to John and the history of right to work. You drew a very stark picture of the disparity between the women-run organizations and the female composition of the teaching force on the ground versus the people who are in the legislature here. And we really got to see that this week, right? Now, one of the knocks against the teacher walkouts so far is that in all the states, they really have not yet produced big electoral change, that you saw people rushing to run in places like Oklahoma, but a lot of them lost. So I'm wondering if you can fill us in on that part of it. How long are the gentlemen that we heard so much from this week in Charleston, how long are they going to be secure in those positions?
That's a really good question. I wish I could predict that. I think that we would be remiss if we didn't consider the large financial backing that some of these long-term legislators have. So we saw come out in this most recent teachers' strike ideas about the role of the Koch brothers through American Prosperity West Virginia and the American Legislative Exchange Council really having a hand in developing and pushing through this legislation. And so we see some real outside corporate interests influencing at least the work of the legislature. And that's difficult to go up against as a grassroots campaign. And so I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you what the unions would say and would hope, but we'll have to see.
Well, John, some of those same gentlemen who we just heard Erin mention have, one of their fondest loves is right to work. It turns out that, they have been passionately advocating for this in some form or another, going back decades. And you had some really interesting history in your paper that I didn't know about. And I thought it would be great if you could sort of fill us in on that, how right to work affected organizing. Because now we're obviously in a position where the entire country is right to work.
Nearly.
Nearly,
Right. And then
yeah.
also, I think when we look at the teacher strikes, it's important to remember what happened in Wisconsin and Michigan, and that they broke these unions, these historically strong unions that define the teaching profession. But I just want to look at, I think, right to work from, again, a Southern context, or within the context of Red for Ed right now.
And can you define it for us, for people who might not know what we're talking about?
Yeah, and I'll do my best. And this is going
Notice
through.
why I handed it over to
Yeah,
you.
thank you, yeah. Blame it on me, or, all the lawyers in the room will come to me when I define this incorrectly. But this is my understanding, especially through labor history. So I'll go back to the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 as sort of outlining the sort of premise of this. And this will be sort of three parts, and the first of which, it bars a closed shop. And a closed shop union will mandate union membership as a condition of employment. So, a district can't say, you have to be a member of the AFT in order to work in this school district. It also bars a secondary or a sympathetic boycott. So a company can't go on boycott or go on strike or enact some sort of boycott in sympathy of a southern state, for instance, who's demanding higher wages. So you can no longer engage in these sympathetic, if you will, boycotts or strikes. And third, then there's Section 14B, which is important, which passes further prohibitions on union organizing, which basically puts a bar on union shop arrangements. So this is after you sign the contract. A union is not allowed to force or coerce an employee to join a union. So you have a right to work in this environment without having to join a union. In a lot of pro-union states, for instance, like in Wisconsin before Scott Walker ruined the state, when I was signed a contract to teach in Wisconsin, I was quickly approached and say, okay, now you're gonna join this union. I was like, I understand, right? So it sort of clamps down on that. But I say this because this is incredibly important to the South and the post-war development of the New South, which is the fastest, to look at Nelson Lichtenstein's work in this area. It's the fastest growing part of the economy in the United States post-war. There's a post-war boom in the South. The military is investing in the South. A lot of companies are moving down south. And when you just travel across 26 in South Carolina, it's evidence of this. We see Boeing there, and they move from Washington, right, a union-friendly state, to go to South Carolina. Volvo is building a plant in North Charleston. BMW is in South Carolina. Businesses and Republicans love the South because of this right-to-work legislation. And after Taft-Hartley, it also puts it at the local level. So local governments, county governments, school districts can pass further legislation to say, we will specifically not negotiate with the SCEA, or we will not negotiate with the AFT when we're talking about teacher contracts. So there's all this legislation that only increases business development in the South. And why does this matter? Is because when the nation is experiencing public sector unionism in the North, so here we can look at Al Shanker in New York. We can see within a 5-year span, over 90% of those public school teachers join a union. In the city of Chicago, that's closer to 80%. In 1968-1969 school year, across the country, there's over 230 strikes, and there's over collectively 2.2 million school days in one school year that are idle days, that teachers are walking off. So the South is looking at this, and they're terrified. And at the same time, the SCEA, South Carolina Education Association, They're demonstrating. Now, these are Southern demonstrations, so there's about 300 people in Charleston, 150 in Columbia, but that's enough to make statewide news. So as New York teachers are going on strike, as Chicago teachers are going on strike, South Carolina educators are marching on the State House, and they're after work, they're, having a demonstration or rally. So Strom Thurmond and other, former Dixiecrat, now new Republican senators and legislators are drawing upon this right-to-work legislation and pushing local school districts to pass anti-union laws, saying, do not allow these teachers to follow the work of the AFT and also the NEA, which is now entering in collective bargaining arrangements in the North. So in the South, they draw upon this legislation at a moment that public sector unionism is on the rise to make sure that Southern states aren't going to unionize. So they win that fight. But at the same time, which is interesting, and I try to make this clear in the article, is as the state is drawing on this right-to-work legislation, largely white teachers themselves are following the lead of the state legislators, and they're forming their own teacher associations, which were just merged. So the NEA orders all state teacher associations across the South to merge. So black and white teacher associations have to form one, which are largely affiliated with the NEA. Well, beginning in 1974, nearly all the southern states begin to form anti-union unions, essentially. In South Carolina, it's the Palmetto State Teacher Association. In Mississippi, it's the Mississippi Educators Association. Utah has one, across the South in all these right-to-work states. And they basically, if you read their teacher association philosophies, the first or second line is always going to be, we do not believe in strikes. This is selfish of teachers. We believe in putting children first. Now to connect to what's going on now, most of these states in the South that are organizing under the Red for Ed banner are coming from these anti-union associations. So they're acting like a union, but embracing these anti-union philosophies. So I think which is actually inhibiting this movement in the South as well. So right to work inhibits unionization, long story short. But at the same time, the teachers themselves are actually embracing the rhetoric and policies behind right to work legislation. So they don't want to pay fees. The last resort is going on strike. So at the end of the day, I think that is further prohibiting this coalition development, which is someone like Reverend Barber is calling for at this very moment to really strengthen this referendum.
That was
Does that
very
help?
well done.
Okay.
Thank you. I want to relate that back to one of the recent walkouts in Denver. Colorado was already a right-to-work state before Janus, and I was talking about the theory of change that's really driving the reinvention of these urban districts. And part of the thinking is that unions are, well, they're bad. You can't drive continuous improvement in schools when you have unions. And so in places like Denver, part of the reason that they've expanded charter schools so aggressively is that the charters are non-union, but then they also have a third variety of school called an innovation school. And one of these will be coming to a city near you soon, I promise. And these are basically autonomous schools that are under the auspices of the school district, but run by an outside operator. And one of the autonomies that school leaders and teachers are given is the freedom to opt out of the union. And so as a result, when Denver teachers went on strike, you may have noticed that, whereas 30-some thousand teachers struck in Los Angeles, the number of teachers who actually walked off the job in Denver was only 2,100. And that's because they have an enormous chunk of teachers who teach in the schools but do not consider themselves members of the union. Now, what happened there that was really interesting was that you had a whole flood of teachers who decided to join the union when they heard about a strike, right? That they too have been following the walkouts from state to state. And so I'm not sure that the theory of change is going to unfold quite as, sort of cohesively as the visionaries think, that once teachers see that they can actually make some demands and win, that's going to look a little bit different. So Susan, I want to ask you to go back to Philadelphia for a minute. Philadelphia was in that huge wave of strikes in the 60s that John alluded to, and they were strikes that proved to be very divisive at a time when cities were facing all sorts of fiscal problems, when white residents were fleeing, the tax base was shrinking. The teachers were really perceived as demanding, being out for themselves, and that legacy lives on. Philadelphia is a place where teachers have really tried to expand that narrative and paint a bigger picture about what it means to be a public school teacher. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
I'll try.
And I'm sorry to spring that on you.
Yes, she didn't warn me, but this is something I think about a lot, and I hope this is responsive. One of my areas of scholarship is sort of the rhetoric of the reform movement. And I think one of the things, I'm curious particularly to hear from Erin on this, that teachers in Philadelphia at least, and that I read about, are responding to is the vilification of teachers that's been going on for quite a while now, that they're selfish, they're only in it for themselves, they don't care about the kids, the privatization people are the only ones who care about the kids. And I think that history of strikes before, which were primarily bread and butter, fed that narrative more than they necessarily should have. It wasn't very nuanced. But at least now, most of the strikes that I have read about and the rhetoric from the teachers in Philadelphia is much more community-oriented. It is much more coming back at that rhetoric and saying, we are here to preserve public education in the community we live in too, which I think is a very different message. I shared with everybody on the panel an op-ed that two of the lead privatizers in Philadelphia, this was their reaction to the teacher strikes, which the headline is, Teachers Strikes a Blow Against Good Schools. And first it trashes the teachers for daring to want pensions, like that's a bad thing. I mean, we're supposed to save for retirement. But the most interesting thing in here, I think, is that it's time for the folks who are not benefiting from their educational system to steal the draining resource play from the union playbook. Districts that continue to fund failing schools actually drain resources from desirable charter schools desperately wanted by parents. This is rhetoric I hear all the time because charters are always portrayed as what parents want. And any parents, including me, because I was a Philadelphia public school parent for a long, long time, who want public schools are portrayed as deluded and people who are not worthy of listening to. So that community connection that I think the teachers' unions are finally and a little belatedly building on, I think is really important. Did that even remotely respond?
Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, I would agree. Some of my previous strike research was in a small rural district in Pennsylvania. And so Pennsylvania is different from West Virginia in that teachers negotiate with the district instead of the state. And in this community, the teacher strike was a real disaster for teachers. They were really kind of cast as greedy outsiders who were out to destroy the district. There was a sign in a storefront window that said, "Make my day, shoot a teacher." And so it's just a reminder, I think, that we talk about these strikes as just, these are things teachers can do, but they're very risky ventures for teachers because public opinion can go into very oppositional directions. And I think you're right that teachers have become much better at crafting the narrative around what's best for children. And it's a pretty easy narrative to craft when we see teachers holding up, obsolete textbooks or, they don't have pencils in the classroom, that should be cause for alarm. And that's not a new thing that teachers are dealing with. It's just that they are just now incorporating that or making that the centerpiece of their protests.
I want to do a lightning round so that we still have some time to have questions from the audience if people are interested. So I'm curious, as we're all sort of obsessively following this stuff. John, let's start with you. I'm curious about, one, if anything's going to happen in South Carolina, and two, if you want to make a bold prediction about what's going to happen in the year ahead vis-a-vis the walkouts.
That's tough. Maybe what's going to happen? I'll start.
Yeah.
I think with South Carolina or across those, I think we're going to see people introducing more and more privatization legislation. I think that so many Americans and even parents see, charter schools, voucher programs, these new education savings accounts are going, this is a silver bullet. This is the panacea that we've been waiting for, that this is the cure-all. I think we're going to see more and more state legislators introduce legislation that privatizes and continues to dismantle our public schools, because if teachers if their demands are reduced to a pay raise, right, I think that allows policymakers to introduce something in addition that's comprehensive like that. So I think that's what we're going to begin to see in the next year more so.
Anything in South Carolina in particular?
So I would like to argue that something already is happening in South Carolina. I mean, we have, this is called SC for Ed. There's 21,000 members, on Facebook, for whatever that means. But we see discourse in South Carolina that we haven't observed since the late 1960s about raises, about public education. The state's major newspaper, the Post and Courier, just ran this 5-part series called Minimally Adequate. So we see a lot of discourse and discussion in ways, I've only been there since 2011, but I've never seen it since that time, and a lot of others really haven't. It's sort of this generational push. So they are already having an impact. It's that slow as molasses sort of movement, but it's happening, and the needle's slowly starting to already sort of move a little bit.
So Erin, you already raised the question that we need to watch and see what happens next in West Virginia. Is there anything else we should be paying attention to? Do you, you've been writing about teacher shortages, rural communities. Since we were seeing West Virginia unfold now, what else should we be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I think we should definitely keep an eye on the bills that are going to be coming forward, particularly out of the Senate in the remaining few weeks of the legislative session, because I think that'll be a good indicator, not just of what the priorities are right now and how teachers will respond, but what the long game is. If we listen to Senator Carmichael talk about the loss or the killing of Bill 451, he doesn't seem entirely defeated, which makes me think that perhaps we'll see some more attempts at legislation come through, and I would not be surprised to see the teachers union flex its muscle, because it had some pretty impressive results in the past week.
And Susan, do you see any sign of a walkout in Philly on the horizon? And also there's a heated debate in your state about addressing some of these funding issues, and particularly sort of cyber charter fraud that we've talked a little bit about. What's going to happen there?
I don't think there will be a walkout, because I think in Philadelphia, the teachers union and the pro-public education movement, which is much bigger than just the teachers, is much more engaged in the political structure, and is starting to have a few victories. So this is a very small anecdote, but I think it's telling. Philadelphia has been privatizing its schools since 2001, really, by turnover of public schools. There was 1 year where they let the parents at the 3 schools that were targeted for turnover vote on whether to go charter, and they all voted no. And they were all very passionate about saving their so-called failing school as part of their community, because these were parents who hadn't chosen to go charter, and they really didn't want to. The upshot was the district stopped letting parents vote, and they turned over some others later anyway. But I do feel like nationally and even on a local level, there's, maybe I'm naive, but a majority of people who do still believe in the citizenship and public part of public education, that they value it, and that it's not just a teacher paycheck issue, that there is something really at risk with the privatization movement. So I'm guardedly hopeful that we can build on that.
Does anybody have any questions? Sir, in the back.
The strike, this bill, is a perfect example of things gone wrong. But to state my experience, I'm a local school board member and I'm on the state school board. I am a Democrat. However, I try to maintain an independent stance. You people who know Senator Jeff Kessler and Scott Barner were very good legislators for years, and Democrats. The three major things that started it last year, as I see it, were salaries, the disintegration of the PDIA, and retirement systems. Well, Jeff Kessler was a very good hand in getting the retirement system in order, and so much so we're probably overfunded, and we wish we could quit contributing back so much to put it into education. The Republicans got into power. They suggested a modest raise, which wasn't enough. But all of a sudden, it's their problem. They got there throughout 40 years or more of a Democratic administration. It's just interesting, and my Republican friends that were in the legislature for a long time would say to me, how'd they get there? It wasn't us. Why are we taking the brunt now? We're trying to do something, and I think really they got hurt last year feelings. You can believe Republicans have feelings hurt. But they did, and it raised them to an ire that they did some things that we were able to control as a state board, talking to them last year and not having charter schools come up, to where all once this bill comes up. Nobody talked to the state board, nobody talked to the administration, nobody talked to any PTA, any citizens group. It was just there. And I think it was partially retaliation, but it was a perfect storm. And maybe it could have been handled differently. I don't know, but it just, it's been a bad year, let's put it that way, because there were so many good things in that bill. They're probably all gone now. I'm not even sure the grades are going to be there listening to the Senate. And the teachers are in a box because they said it's not about the salary.
Well, that's a less hopeful note, I guess, than the last panel ended on. But I think we're out of time, and I want to thank the participants for a great discussion.
Yes, that was,
You're speaking to the choir here. Josh, I don't know whether it would have been possible to have somebody on the other side, on the panel, doesn't scream and yell, that talks realistically with these people. What you say, we all pretty much agree with.
yeah, well, the teacher strikes and the walkouts and the teacher activism generally has been something we wanted to pay tribute to because it's been so impressive, so inspiring. I mean, it really did spark a national movement, and I think we've heard from those perspectives here, and I think that's my purpose for inviting all of them, and I think they did a terrific job. Could we give them a hand? So I would like to, while they're exiting, I would like to invite my colleague, Professor Suzanne Reese, to introduce our featured speaker for the morning.